For a century, the photochemical process was the backbone of cinema. Light struck the emulsion on a strip of celluloid, physical chemical reaction happened. That interaction defined what film looked like. When digital imaging arrived to claim the market from film, almost everything was a compromise. The aesthetic wasn't there, the latitude wasn't there, the tools to grade it properly weren't there. So all we had to do was wait. What we were waiting for, it turned out, was two separate races running simultaneously, which only emerged recently and whose collision most working filmmakers still don't fully understand. This piece is about camera sensors, what they are, how they work, and why the two lineages of digital imaging, cinema and photography, were built on completely different engineering philosophies, and why the camera you're evaluating right now to purchase is the product of that collision. The history matters because it explains the compromises still baked into the tools you're using today, and the science matters because without it, you're making an expensive decision based on marketing language, more than likely. And the modern synthesis matters because the gap between what you can afford and what gets projected in the theater has never been smaller, if you know what you're actually looking for. So we're going to dive in. This one's going to be longer than the large format look. I'm almost positive. I've spent about 72 hours writing this article, and if you'd rather read it, it's available on provideocoalition.com. So before 2008, digital photography and digital cinema were entirely separate species, engineered by different teams with generally conflicting priorities. The photography sensor was built to replace a single static frame of film. The engineering priority was spatial resolution, so cramming as many microscopic pixels onto the silicon as possible. Still photographers care more about micro contrast, edge-to-edge sharpness, and resolution sufficient for large physical prints to be shown in museums and galleries across the world. To achieve this, modern still sensors completely omit or severely weaken the optical low-pass filter, or OLPF, which is the glass layer that softens high-frequency patterns before they reach the sensor. Why would you want to mush out your image if fidelity is most important? Because a still photographer only needs to capture a single moment, readout speed is a secondary concern. The mechanical shutter opens, sensor gets exposed, the shutter closes, and the processor gets as much time as it needs. This is a Fujifilm GFX 50R. Listen to this thing. That's slow. Cinema sensors were built for a completely different job. In motion picture acquisition, omitting an OLPF is a serious operational risk because high-frequency patterns like brick walls, fine fabrics, pinstripes, whatever, will cause severe aliasing and moire that is virtually impossible to remove in post. That's when things get a little rainbowy in someone's t-shirt and whatnot. This also creates a modern problem on LED volume stages, and it's the same exact reason why filming a computer screen or your phone at home looks terrible. True cinema sensors feature thick, mathematically optimized OLPFs combined with infrared cut filters, explicitly prioritizing color fidelity and motion rendering over artificial digital sharpness. There's a second fundamental difference that almost never gets explained, and that's readout architecture. In any sensor that reads rows of pixels sequentially from top to bottom, fast motion produces something called rolling shutter. This happens because the top of the frame was captured at a slightly different moment than the bottom. Stills cameras could hide this because physical shutters freeze the scene before the readout begins. Cinema cameras, which never close the shutter between frames, can't hide it at all. You could introduce it in certain stills cameras, but it's fundamentally unlikely. Eliminating rolling shutter through faster readouts, stacked CMOS architectures, or full global shutters has been one of the defining engineering challenges of the last 2 decades. And it goes a long way towards explaining why photography silicon and cinema silicon were kept so far apart for so long. Before the history lesson, we'll take a quick detour on terminology because the phrase large format has meant completely different things at different points in this story. And if you're confused by it, you're in good company. Calling something a large sensor has always been relative to whatever small broadcast architecture filmmakers are trying to escape. When mirrorless video systems arrived around 2010, the industry called Micro Four Thirds large format because compared to the 2/3 inch television chips that preceded it, it was enormous. When dedicated digital cinema cameras started arriving with Super 35 sensors matched to the physical dimensions of 35mm motion picture film, nobody called that large format. It was just Super 35 because cameras like the D21 from Ari were direct competitors to traditional film, so there didn't need to be marketing distinction. Then, when manufacturers started building systems around the 36 by 24 millimeter footprint of 35 millimeter stills photography, which photographers call full frame and what the industry started calling large format, the goalposts move again. So today, large format cinema means 65 millimeter equivalent sensors like the RED 265, the Fujifilm GFX Eterna 55, the new Sony Venice 2 block that was announced at Cinegear last week. Next year, it might mean, I don't know, 8 by 10 sensors. The point is, large format is a relative marketing term, not an absolute specification. So when you hear it, just make sure you check large relative to what, So getting onto the timeline with that established, things will start to make more sense because the two markets, photo and video, kind of cross-pollinated until an ultimate actual conflagration. No, that's like fire, isn't it? The story starts in the prosumer and broadcast world. Panasonic rules in the underground with the DVX 100 in 2002, containing consumer 1/3 inch broadcast CCDs, but with Cinegamma processing, but true 24p cadence recorded to mini DV tape. They also pushed the broadcast boundary with the original VariCam in 2001, pioneering variable frame rates on 2/3 inch 3-chip CCD blocks recording to DVC Pro HD tape. Canon counters with the XL series. Shoulder mount form factor, swappable lenses still on tiny 1/3 inch CCD blocks and mini DV tape. But one of the earliest cameras with the proper EF mount adapter, although that crop factor was insane. The lenses on it were quite nice, though. I still have my XL2. Sony defines the high end with the F900 in 2000 that they developed with George Lucas, who then went and shot Star Wars Episode 2 in 2001, making it the first Hollywood blockbuster shot entirely on digital, which did end up highlighting some pretty significant problems. But under the hood, it's a high-definition broadcast system, a 3 CCD prism recording to HD cam, with the incoming light split through an optical glass prism before hitting those 3 separate red, green, and blue sensors. The key thing to understand about all these cameras is that the silicon belonged to the newsroom. Cinegamma was software mimicry, artificially stretching contrast matrices trying to prevent harsh highlight clipping on sensors that were never designed for cinematic dynamic range. They were digital cameras trying to think like film, and it was pretty obvious. Film is still dominant. Red Digital Cinema releases the Red 1 in 2007 with a 4K Super 35 CMOS sensor, proving that compressed digital RAW could challenge film at only $17,500 compared to the $250,000 options on the market, and the idea of affordable cinema enters the conversation. High-end Hollywood, meanwhile, is running cameras like the RED20 and D21, the Panavision Genesis, and the Sony F35, which were actually the same sensor, which were heavy purpose-built systems designed for accurate RGB capture at 2K with zero motion distortion. Then in August 2008, Nikon releases the D90, the first DSLR ever to shoot video at a modest 720p with very low bitrate compression and some of the worst rolling shutter I've ever seen in my life. I did own that camera. It also had true 24p. 1 month later, Canon drops the 5D Mark II. Now, these cameras were built for photography, specifically well, the D90 wasn't for photojournalism, but the 5D certainly was. And so to output video, they performed line skipping, omitting rows of sensor data in real time to prevent the processor from overheating, and also data rate issues. So this introduced severe moire, aliasing, and again, rolling shutter. But filmmakers tolerated it because it delivered the full frame, shallow depth of field aesthetic that was previously impossible at a lower budget without using the Lettuce or Red Rock depth of field adapters, lens adapters that introduced their own problems. What made the 5D Mark II a cultural moment was the photographer Vincent Laforet. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer and filmmaker, and he was given a pre-production unit to borrow for 72 hours before anyone could ever get their hands on it. And he came back with a short film called Reverie, which had helicopter shots and car mounts and moody nighttime New York cityscapes. And it completely changed the world overnight. That, the credit sequence was longer, almost as long as the film itself, but that was all it took. The independent film industry was immediately drunk on extreme shallow depth of field from the full frame sensor and, an 85 1.2 lens that you could now do that you couldn't do previously. Back in the day on like the DVX 100, the trick was you would just zoom all the way in and stand as far back as possible to get any depth of field reduction, to make anything blurry. Anyway, the engineering compromises were real for that, though. The 5D Mark II had no native 24p at launch, which came from a firmware update 2 years later in 2010. The line skipping, like I said, was bad. The rolling shutter, still bad. Not as bad as the D90. But still, from my memory, I don't know, but it probably wasn't as bad. But photography silicon had finally entered the cinema conversation, carrying all of its photographic baggage, and the industry would be untangling the consequences for the next 15 years. So now ARRI introduces the Alexa in 2010. The ALEV 3 sensor, the Super 35 3.4K sensor with an 8.25 micron pixel pitch, which we'll get to, hits the market, takes everyone by storm. Rather than chasing resolution, ARRI focuses entirely on its architecture. So dynamic range, highlight, roll-off, tonal fluidity, colors from film formats. And it becomes an industry monopoly for the next decade. Sony came out with the F65 and the F55, but they see limited adoption while being technically interesting. The FS7 and C300 series carve out the workhorse in the documentary tier. And on the still side, Sony launches the A7S in 2014. But they deliberately capped the full frame sensor at 12 megapixels so the individual photosites were large enough to read out the full sensor without line skipping. This also created a low light benchmark that exceeded expectations for compact video and reset how we can think about making videos on a consumer budget. At the same time, Nikon dropped the D800 in 2012, which allowed for clean, uncompressed HDMI output, essentially birthing the external recorder ecosystem. The Atomos Ninja quickly becomes a standard issue on indie sets. The Odyssey 7Q Plus makes its way to professional sets. And Nikon, once again, doesn't get credit for starting something that we use to this day. Stacked CMOS architectures, where the pixel layer is physically bonded to a dedicated processing chip but directly beneath it, allow data to clear the sensor at speeds previously impossible. Rolling shutter becomes manageable, even in Still's flagship bodies. Sony takes the A7 III sensor, puts it directly in the FX6 and FX3, making photo first silicon Netflix-approved cinema bodies. And the line between camera types completely dissolves. Sony then launches the Venice and Venice 2 with purpose-built full-frame cinema sensors. ARRI finally replaces the ALEV 3 with the Alexa 35 in 2022 and the new ALEV 4 sensor with the Log C4 and Reveal color science. Staying true to its roots at 4.6, not going full tilt on the resolution race, but delivering 15 stops of dynamic range at a signal-to-noise ratio of 2, or 16.3 stops at signal-to-noise 1, by CineD's measurements at least. ARRI says that it's 17 stops, but they, any manufacturer tends to count any little notch at the bottom of the stops chart as counting. But I'll go with CineD. So today, following Nikon's acquisition of RED, the Nikon ZR arrives with the same 24.5 megapixel partially stacked sensor from the Z6 III, but running RED color science and recording a 12-bit R3D any RAW format. Photo hardware, cinema DNA, the convergence reaches its logical conclusion. Meanwhile, ARRI releases the Alexa 265, which is a stitched array of the ALEV 3 sensors, now at 65 millimeter scale, using that new, up till then only for the Alexa 35, Reveal color science and Log C4 format. Blackmagic releases the Ursa 65 17K, Fujifilm with the Eterna 55, the large format race continues ever upward. So that's the history. Now we can get into the science, which is where most of this history actually lives. So a fun thing that most people don't know, a sensor is completely colorblind. It's just an array of microscopic light-sensitive cavities called photosites, or sensors, which I think is cute. Those register the quantity of incoming photons and translate that energy into an electrical voltage that is then read by the camera. You can think of a sensor as kind of one of those pin art toys from the oddities store, where you'd put your face or your hand in it and it would stay that way, where the height of each pin corresponds to the voltage accumulated by that photosite, and the piece of plastic at the end is the what's called full well capacity, which is the point at which the cavity, the photosite clips and can't record anything else. So to construct a color image, engineers will lay this checkerboard pattern of dyed chemical filters over the sensor wafer called a Bayer filter. It's 50% green photosites, 25% red, and 25% blue. Green carries the dominant luminance information, which is why it gets twice the representation. And that is because that mirrors how our human eyes see light, our sensitivity to green wavelengths. So this matrix of this array means that a native 4K sensor does not actually capture a 4K color frame, so to speak. It records a monochrome grid of varying voltages and then relies entirely on a mathematical algorithm known as debayering or demosaicing to reconstruct a full RGB image. This matrix means that a native 4K sensor does not capture a 4K color frame, so to speak. It records a monochrome grid of varying voltages and relies entirely on a mathematical algorithm known as debayering or demosaicing to reconstruct a full RGB image. So you know how you put a gel in front of a light and it doesn't allow any wavelengths through that aren't the gel's color? That's how the Bayer filter works. That's how all those color filters work. So each photosite is only getting whatever the voltage is. The computer knows, oh, that's how much green there is now, but it doesn't know what the red and the blue are. So the algorithm looks at each photosite, cheats off its neighbor's homework, and calculates the missing color wavelengths. So this is unavoidable in any Bayer sensor. That's just how they work. This is why dedicated monochrome cameras resolve sharper images and achieve higher sensitivities. Because with no color filter in the way, every pixel maps 1-to-1 with the raw reaction to light, and there's no math needed. So the physical width of an individual photosite, called pixel pitch, which is measured in microns, is the primary physical variable governing baseline data capacity. So in the cinema side of things, we tend to have a pixel pitch of 6 to 9 microns. Dedicated cinema sensors, like in the Arri Alexa, which has a pixel pitch of 8.25 microns, use photosites that are real big with immense full well capacity. Like we said, they don't clip. They can hold a substantial amount more electrical charge before clipping. This provides the wide exposure latitude needed for natural highlight retention and a clean, stable shadow noise floor. So literally just bigger buckets than the hybrid cameras, which tend to have a pixel pitch of 2 to 4 microns because they're trying to put a ton of small pixels on there for high megapixel image capture. It's the same size of sensor, let's say, full frame, Super 35, whatever. They're just dividing that same sensor into millions more smaller, not buckets, but I guess thimbles. These will saturate faster, clip more aggressively, and to keep shadows above the noise floor, these cameras have to apply hardware-level noise reduction that can tend to bake a smooth plastic texture directly into the raw video file. So if big photosites are better, why not just keep making them bigger? The issue is that if you scale a pixel pitch towards 12 or 13 microns within a standard Super 35 physical dimension, you're limited to a native resolution of about 2K. It's like 22 or 2000 by 1100, I think. So you physically can't achieve 4K delivery at that pixel size without scaling the sensor up. into, in that case, like medium format territory. The full well capacity gains also introduce a secondary challenge, which is that larger capacitance makes high speed readout more demanding. And if charge transfer efficiency is insufficient, residual charge can persist between frames, and it'll look like ghosting or smearing, where you're seeing the last frame kind of permeate into the next one. ARRI's 8.25 micron ALEV3 isn't some physical optimum that they discovered. It's just interesting that they corner the area of the market that has large pixel pitch, and is kind of a historical outlier that just sat at a particularly successful balance point between dynamic range, sensitivity, resolution, and cost. Also, because it's a sensor from before, which we'll get into, we can use computers to help, bridge the gap between small pixel, big pixel. So to explain it plainly, larger pixels, higher full well capacity, better per pixel signal to noise ratio, stronger low light performance, but a lower resolution at a fixed sensor size. Smaller pixels, higher spatial resolution, better oversampling potential, but noisier per pixel performance and faster highlight clipping. Potentially. Again, we're going to get into it. Computers. It's interesting. Many modern cinema camera sensors have pixel pitches well below 6 microns and still deliver exceptional image quality. Two hardware developments seem to have made this possible. One is backside illuminated architecture. So on legacy sensors, transistor circuit traces sat in front of the photosite layer, blocking incoming light. The BSI architecture, backside illuminated, moves this circuitry behind the photosite substrate. The wafer is thinned and flipped so light can enter from the back, hitting the photodiodes directly with nothing in the way. This improves the probability of a photon being captured by one of those photosites tremendously. The other advancement is gapless microlens arrays. So on top of all the photosites are these little lenses that, like any lens, shoot the light into the photosite. Those lenses are curved precisely over each individual photosite and capture light that would have otherwise hit the area around the photosite and throw them directly into the active well, so to speak. You can think of like if you've ever been up close to a LED wall, like at a concert, you'll notice that the pixels are actually pretty far apart, but when you stand far back, it's not that big of a deal. If you were to shine light at it, it'll hit mostly the black plastic and not the actual LED. That's like scaled up, kind of what we're talking about. In any case, together, these explain why a modern 4.14 micron cinema sensor, like the one in the Venice 2 8.6K, displays a signal-to-noise ratio profile that would have been physically impossible about a decade ago. Again, ARRI fixed a problem from then, Sony fixed a problem from now. So when you capture and deliver 8.6K and deliver a 4K master, the rendering engine takes a cluster of adjacent semi-noisy pixels and averages their values into a single unified 4K pixel. Because digital sensor noise is completely random from pixel to pixel, averaging it cancels it out. Shadow detail lifts cleanly, aliasing and moire tend to disappear, and the need for an aggressively thick OLPF is reduced. So it's two philosophies, same destination with these manufacturers, specifically ARRI and Sony. The Alexa, with its 8.25 micron sensor, relies on a pure analog hardware stability. So highlight roll-off is encoded at the hardware layer. Files are lightweight because they're smaller, as opposed to like 8K, and at extreme exposure depths where there aren't enough photons to register an advanced signal, like a good signal, a large native pixel always maintains cleaner noise floor. The Venice 2, on the other hand, or the high-res cameras in general, talking about Sony specifically, relies on that aforementioned post-production computing. So the downsampled 4K pixel is built from the true physical readings of multiple distinct photosites, bypassing the neighbor borrowing interpolation of standard debayering. The color's pure, fine textures dissolve with organic micro contrast, And the 8.6K dataset gives editorial enormous flexibility. So you can punch in 200% on a 4K timeline, stabilize very easily, reframe however you want without dropping below the delivery resolution. This is how Fincher works. He shoots at a high resolution, frames for a smaller extraction, and is able to make the image exactly the way he wants in post, eliminating things that might take up time, like having, if there's a bump in the track with a dolly track, you can just stabilize that out. I've been told that he stabilizes every single shot, even if it's static, just rock solid. It also helps VFX, although VFX will probably be mad at you if you give them enormous resolution, but theoretically more data is better, right? But in any case, neither strategy is inherently superior. They just represent different engineering philosophies optimized for different production priorities. So when you choose between letting the camera scale down to 4K internally from a larger sensor versus shooting the full image and downsampling in post, you're choosing between operational speed and mathematical image preservation. In-camera supersampling is primarily a frame rate and data management play. On the Blackmagic Ursa 12K, shooting the full 12K maxes out at 60 FPS, but switching to the in-camera scaled 4K unlocks 120 FPS without changing the field of view. That's because the Ursa has a slightly different non-Bayer pattern, which still has the red, green, and blue, but it incorporates a white or technically clear filter, which means that the standard red and green and blue photosites still get their data, but you have one pure white data in a square. So the sensors can regroup and scale the output internally across the full sensor without having to crop anything. Those clear photosites pass all the wavelengths of light, increasing the sensitivity, but it does mean that you have to use the demosaicing, truthfully, approach that Blackmagic invented. So I think they have, yeah, it works in Premiere, but at first for a minute there, it was only in Resolve because that was the only people who knew how to do that. In-camera scaling will also obviously shrink your data footprint because you're only shooting 4K instead of 12K, just like any other camera. Now, there is a cost. Lab testing shows that the original 12K from Blackmagic, the Ursa, downsampled in post yields approximately 2.4 stops of dynamic range. Switching the same camera to in-camera 4K drops that to roughly 11.3 stops. The hardware chips use simplified high-speed shortcuts to process the frame in real time, which is far less sophisticated than a desktop GPU, and it shows up in softness and slight artifacting. Your frame is obviously also permanently locked at that, size. I will say the Ursa Cine 12K LF does not show this issue. Once again, computing is changing things up for us. I don't have it's in the article. Go read the article if you want more specific facts, but and links to sources. But the Cine 12K LF seems to maintain the same 12 point whatever stops of dynamic range, kind of no matter what you do. But it will get better if you do it in post, but it doesn't necessarily drop if you do it in camera, which is pretty cool. And actually, now that I say that, I remember Blackmagic told me this, so I didn't even need to look it up. So when you do it in post, you're shooting full raster 12K, handing it to DaVinci Resolve, and that uses the GPU's 32-bit floating point processing to execute proper downsampling on the computer. You'll recover that potential missing stop of dynamic range we talked about. You'll get a 300% punch-in safety net. The micro contrast is smooth and organic, and skin tones and fabric and distant landscapes will resolve completely free of artificial digital sharpening edges. It'll be smooth. It'll look great. The cost there, though, is serious GPU VRAM issues. You need a pretty beefy computer to do it. Your processor has to be better. If you add too many, plugins or have too many nodes, or you're, trying to do Magic Mask, that can all take forever on a much bigger thing. And you're locked to the physical readout of the full sensor, the speed at which it can read. So you don't get that aforementioned like 120 FPS. But generally, we only need 24p, right? Neither approach, again, is universally correct. They're just different production contexts. So if pixel pitch determines how many photons the sensor collects, the color filter array determines how accurately it analyzes them. We'll use ARRI and Sony as the dominant cinema systems, and we can see that they take two different approaches to their color filter arrays. So ARRI's color scientists intentionally tuned their CFA to permit a more broad but very calculated amount of spectral overlap between the red, green, and blue channels. This mirrors the overlapping spectral sensitivities of both the human eye and photochemical film stocks. Because ARRI's large photosites minimize spatial crosstalk through sheer physical geometry, no aggressive semiconductor barriers are really needed on the wafer. The result is shifting hues transition seamlessly into one another, and skin tones render with organic, creamy gradation across delicate highlights and shadows, and everything is nice and smooth like we know ARRI to be. The CFA handles the tonal blending at the hardware level, and the sensor captures into the ARRI wide gamut format with minimal downstream mathematical manipulation. Sony's CFA, on the other hand, is optimized for highly selective, distinct spectral profiles, maximizing clean color separation. Because the densely packed photosites on these high-resolution Venice sensors would otherwise bleed into one another, Sony pairs their CFA with backside illuminated architecture that we mentioned and what's called deep trench isolation. Deep trench isolation, good heavens. Which are microscopic physical walls etched between the pixels to systematically eliminate spatial crosstalk. The result is a pristine hardware baseline that lets colorists push grading vectors and saturation to structural extremes in post without breaking any gamut boundaries. You know, when you escape the color gamut, that's when you see colors just clip. But on the post side, not the camera side. Well, also on the camera side, but that's what we're talking about. Sony also developed a new chemical composition for the Venice CFA specifically to kind of combat that Sony look that everyone seemed to despise that was out of the box. But the core architecture remains an uncompromised map of the physical scene. So that's the cinema side. On the prosumer side, there is a compromise. Consumer mirrorless cameras use a weak, highly transmissive color filter array to maximize quantum efficiency, which is how efficient a photosite is at receiving photons and converting them. And they do this because they're trying to advertise their, dual native ISOs as high as 12,800, for instance. So by thinning the filter dyes, more photons can reach the silicon, raising the sensitivity, but this causes a massive spectral overlap where the red, green, and blue channels contaminate each other, destroying native color separation. In this case, the camera's processor has to apply a color matrix transformation downstream to forcefully separate the channels before writing them to the card as an image. Now, under standard lighting, this is pretty much invisible, but under mixed or narrow spectrum light, like cheap LEDs or emergency lights from police cars and stuff, it'll trigger severe what's called metametric failure. I had a color scientist from the academy who I hang out with, who I can't name, explained this to me a few weeks ago, and I had no idea it would come in handy this quickly. So if you expose a consumer hybrid camera to an intense narrow spectrum like blue LED, the weak blue filter saturates instantly, and the maxed out value hits the internal 3x3 matrix. The error multiplies. The math attempts to separate the data that's already flatlined, and the result is a blocky neon smear that every colorist knows and dreads and can't fix in post. Now, there are two cameras that broke the standard Bayer mold that deserve their own attention because they illustrate just how different the approaches to color capture can be. The first, both of them are made by Sony. The first is the Sony 65, where they developed a unique ultra-dense color filter array with a native color footprint so large that it outperformed motion picture print film and approached the physical limits of human visual perception. This is actually why they had to make S-Log3 Cine, or S-Gamut 3, whatever that, because the original S-Log3 gamut was like no one at the time could figure out how to harness it. We didn't have ACEs and whatnot yet, so it just was a mess at the time. Now it's better. We'll get into that. That color filter array was so good that they put that dye formulation into the conventional Bayer grid for the F55, which I own, purely so that the junior camera could inherit the color space of the F65. F65. I'm really struggling today. And try to compete with the Alexa, which had come out at the same time, but we all know how that went. Architecturally, the F65 used a 45-degree rotated layout called the Q67 geometry. In a standard 4K Bayer sensor, the green channel, which carries the dominant luminance information, as we said, is arranged in a checkerboard pattern that delivers only half of the target resolution, relying on downstream demosaicing to fill in the gaps. The F65 rotated its array, providing a dedicated physical green photosite for every single coordinate of the final 4K output frame, while red and blue continue to be interpolated from the neighboring photosites. The luminance channel, the resolution critical one, was resolved at full 4K with zero interpolation directly at the hardware level. Scientists say this was incredible. The second camera, or pair of cameras actually, also come from Sony. They are the Panavision Genesis and the Sony F35, which came later once the deal had run out with Panavision. So before CMOS sensors became the standard, those two cameras, that one sensor, shared the same custom Super 35 CCD architecture. These CCD sensors transfer charge sequentially across the substrate without per pixel transistors cluttering up the wafer, which maximizes the active light gathering area. You recall earlier, before backside illuminated stuff, we had a bunch of gaps in the way. This helped. This was better, so to speak. So Sony paired that with a heavily saturated pigment matrix and an RGB stripe filter array, not a Bayer mosaic. So the sensor's 5.7K photosites were binned 2-to-1 vertically, treating every 3 horizontal photosites as a single red, green, blue subpixel triad, which yielded a true 1920 by 1080 HD output with discrete hardware-isolated RGB values for every single pixel. So there's no interpolation, no borrowing from the neighbors, full color depth at the hardware layer. This is the actual source of the warm, continuous skin tones for which legacy CCDs are still celebrated. It's still sometimes incorrectly called a film look, but it was more so that it was specifically a hardware-driven approach to full color pixel capture that no modern Bayer sensor could replicate. Also, it's important to note that CCDs in general were not better. These were just pretty damn good. So we shouldn't reach back too far and say, oh, we should all go back to CCD. Again, modern sensors, modern technology has bridged a lot of these gaps. So while the sensor establishes the theoretical limit of your image quality, the recording format establishes the realized limit. So you can have a perfect sensor and a terrible pipeline, and your output will reflect, more often than not, the pipeline. So this brings us to bit depths. Bit depth dictates how many discrete tonal steps are available per color channel. So with 8-bit, like on the C100 Mark II here, you've got 256 steps per channel. So if you shoot an 8-bit log profile and those data points are real sparse, you're going to get stretched razor thin across a high dynamic range scene. This is why I invented owl color. So if you shoot a C100, look up owl color, kind of fixes that at the camera level, but it's not technically log, it's log adjacent, log C log adjacent, C log 1. Anyway, doesn't matter. Sales pitch over. Also, when you try to use it in a modern color management pipeline, it's going to upscale that 8-bit into a 32-bit workspace, and the math just pulls those points apart, and you start to see stair-stepping, banding, blocky noise in the shadows. It's not great for cinema. It's not terrible. I mean, this, again, still looks awesome, and I still color grade this, but you have to be a little more gentle. With 10-bit, we basically have the baseline professional cinema standard. So ProRes 422, XAVC with Sony, XF-AVC with Canon. This gives you 4 times the data density of 8-bit. So that's enough to survive any kind of color grading you may need to do within reason. 10 tend to run into issues on most cameras shooting straight up 10-bit. Then you've got 12-bit. So that's ProRes Quad 4, Cinema Raw Light, and the Canons. That has 16 times the structural resolution of 10-bit. So that's ideal for, real nice stuff while still being in a traditional workflow. I could see music videos and commercials that are going to be like seen on television. 10-bit would still be perfectly acceptable. 12-bit is like, that's the good stuff at that point. And then finally you have 16-bit. So that's most of the raw formats like ARRI RAW, the RAW coming out of the RAW recorder from the Venice, I think it's in body now. So with that, you've got over 65,000 discrete steps per channel, which is a lot more than 256. It's basically the raw linear voltage of the sensor with zero rounding error, zero adjustment. It is raw. But there are trade-offs, right? So digital silicon is a linear device. So when you double the light, you double the voltage. But human perception is logarithmic, far more sensitive to subtle changes in shadows than in bright highlights. This is something you want to keep track of when you're lighting your scene, changing angles and matching them, or matching in post even. Pay attention to the shadow details. The audience will forgive highlights changing way more than they will shadows. So this creates a pretty big problem if you try to store a high dynamic range scene in a scene linear image in a limited container. In a linear system, the brightest stop before clipping consumes exactly half of your entire bit budget, because again, we're doubling, right? Every step we're doubling, which means that it's also halving. So the brightest thing gets half of the image. The next stop takes half of what remains. The next stop takes half of that, et cetera, et cetera. So by the time you reach the deep shadows, those, important details, you have fractions of a single step to describe an entire stop of detail. The shadows areas of your image are just completely starved of data, and those are the ones that we want to save. This is why uncompressed linear recording requires 16-bit. Even there, the brightest stop steals 32,768 of your 65,536 steps. But thousands remain for the shadows, but it's still not the greatest option. I mean, it technically is, but log is in many ways better. So logarithmic encoding is the cure for that need, right? That's going to be super data heavy. You're going to need big old server to hold all that 16-bit raw. Why not shoot 12 or 10-bit? The log curve, which was designed by Panavision, the log curve was designed by Kodak for film scanning. That's where we get Cineon. And then in cameras, I think in 2005, the Panavision Genesis that we spoke about, that F23, had Panalog in it. And then right after, the D20 or D21 from ARRI introduced Log C, original Log C. Prior to that, literally the Genesis and the D21 or D20, whichever it was, we were dealing with those hybrid gamma or hyper gamma profiles that we spoke about, which were just trying to take not even 709, but 601, Rec 601, and trying to mush the highlights down and the shadows up. And you would go into the settings and you would manually adjust things to fit your preference. And that's actually where I got the original owl color for the C100. The idea there was to go like, you know what? This is basically a hyper gamma log, C-Log 1. I'm just going to do the old school thing. And it seems to have worked for hundreds of people, maybe thousands. I don't know. I haven't looked at the number, but definitely hundreds. Anyway, log curves apply a nonlinear mathematical transform to the linear sensor voltages before compression, right? Turns your linear thing log, then saves it versus just saving the linear image to a big ass file. So instead of letting the brightest stop hijack 50% of the container, a 10-bit, for instance, log profile assigns roughly 70 to 80 steps to every stop of light, uniformly doing so from the deepest shadows to the clipping threshold. It's also important to note that log is not a creative look like some younger creators might think. It's just an optimization tool designed to maximize the storage efficiency of a limited bit depth container, right? So there's no log C look. There's no slog3 look, so to speak. It's just math. This brings us to raw versus compressed. So in a standard video pipeline, the camera performs that debayering process we talked about and applies a white balance matrix to let the image look the way it's supposed to, and bakes all that into the pixels on set, right? The file, what you see is what you get. Many profiles also employ chroma subsampling. So you may have heard of 422, 420. 420 throws away about 75% of the color information, storing chroma at half the horizontal and half the vertical resolution of the luminance channel. Once baked in, white balance in post is destructive. You know, you're twisting pre-calculated pixels to fit your needs. Now, with higher bit rates, that's not impossible, obviously, but yeah, it's not a good look. Higher bit depths, I should say. You want, generally, if you're shooting compressed, want to nail your white balance on set. Now, a true RAW format bypasses the debayering process on the camera entirely. So the camera records the raw, unmanipulated voltages from the colorblind photosites, puts them in a data container with the lens, white balance, and ISO metadata. And because the debayering math is deferred to your post computer, your GPU, your whatever, white balance and exposure adjustments are completely non-destructive because you're not altering the footage, you're just altering the metadata rules that guide how the software is interpreting the voltages, not the voltages themselves, right? So with compressed formats, we have two types generally. We have all I, all intra, and long GOP, long GOP. So in an all intra codec, every frame is compressed as a standalone photograph with zero dependency on any adjacent frames like it does with long GOP. So any grain that you may like, not grain, but noise that you find pleasing, I guess, smoke, rain, complex motion, fine details, all perfectly preserved, no problem there. It's more film-like, you know, where each image is its own image, than long GOP, which records one iframe, one of those images, like all intra, but then for the next 12 or 24 frames, records only the pixels that change. So that's super efficient for static interviews, but because of that temporal algorithm that it's using, it's trying to smooth out any differences that aren't the image. So fine textures in stuff, rapid motion, anything like that, might see that as noise, as sensor noise, and think it's an error and then smooth it out across frames. You can also, in the extreme circumstances, get ghosting, but in any case, that can produce the plastic smeary texture that makes long GOP footage immediately identifiable. And I will say, keep an eye, depending on the camera, on which one you select, because it's embarrassing, but I don't want to say how long it took me to realize why my C70 footage was noticeably worse than my C500 footage. It's just that the options are right next to each other, and the only difference is all I or long GOP. And I fixed it now. But again, long GOP for interviews, especially, like I shoot doc, can be worth it if you're going to be shooting really long interviews and that person doesn't really move that much. You'll never notice. But I don't even think there is a long GOP option in the C500. I don't think, but it doesn't matter. In any case, that brings us to bit rate, which is different than bit depth. So bit depth is like color information, more or less, like the thickness of your color, so to speak. And bit rate is the speed limit of your pipeline. So a sensor can collect an incredibly dense data set, but it can cap the recording bit rate at 100 megabits per second, and the compression algorithm is forced to discard data, which can cluster up micro contrast and edge detail into uniform blocks and permanently compress the subtle gradations of skin texture and complex lighting, across, again, gradients. A lot of this stuff is problematic in gradient and fine detail areas unless you give it more information to work with. But again, bit rate and bit depth are not the same thing. You can have a 10-bit codec at a stingy bit rate that looks objectively worse than a competing 10-bit codec at a higher one, right? So this brings us to the paradigm shift that ties all this history together. When digital cinema first arrived, you were trapped by the manufacturer's internal math. If you shot a Sony F55 in 2013, you had to fight the early factory lookup tables, the LUTs that they provided, that aggressively pushed greens or felt clinical out of the box, looked goofy, clipped easily. They weren't made to achieve a cinematic image. They were made to create a correct image, right? Not an emotionally correct one, but a technical one. So people like Art Adams, my colleague over at Pro Video Coalition, who is now the product manager at ARRI, would do stuff like create custom LUTs with like online tools that would allow him to, in this case, create the LC709A LUT that you would put into the F55 and bake that in, right? Because no one had Resolve at normal levels or baseline. It was hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands of dollars, and it wasn't affordable. So you had to kind of go with the baked in look that the camera gave you. And so these technical gymnastics just became kind of necessary if you even knew to do them. The color science was essentially, in that case, locked into the hardware. And if it was wrong, you were wrong with it. That bottleneck is now gone. Scene-referred 32-bit floating point color management frameworks like ACES and DaVinci Resolve Color Management understand the exact physical properties of older sensors with a precision that didn't exist when those cameras were new. So an input device transform, or an IDT, or a CST, color space transform as some people call it, can mathematically reach into those old raw or log files, strip away the camera's legacy on-set processing, and drop the unmanipulated sensor readings directly onto a pristine, ultra-wide color canvas for which you can manipulate as you see fit. Even high bit depth, high bit rate 709 images can be converted into RCM or ACES with relative success, as long as there's no clipping, and be manipulated in roughly the same way. So modern software has uncoupled color science from camera hardware almost entirely. This has triggered a genuine renaissance for older cameras. A camera that cost as much as a car in 2012 and felt limited at the time was limited by the software available to handle its output, not by the silicon. So when you go on forums and you see people complaining about stuff, it's usually because they didn't have the post-production tools for which to properly use the image that they were capturing. So that limitation is gone. The physical data was always there. It's just today you have often free tools like Resolve to manipulate them, and the results can stand shoulder to shoulder with any modern flagship in any theater. It's getting very dark, so I'm going to wrap this up. Here's what this history lesson has actually been building towards. We waited for the silicon to catch up to film, then we waited for the software to catch up to the silicon. Both races have now been won, which means the camera that you can afford is substantially better than you've been told, and the camera you've been told you need is probably doing less work than its marketing implies. When choosing a camera, don't be seduced by manufacturer advertised color science versions or out-of-the-box LUT profiles. It's certainly not certain creators' LUT profiles. But color is a post-production software choice, not a hardware purchase. Your sole priority when evaluating a sensor is one question. How robust is the physical data set it collects? Whichever sensor harvests the thickest, most unmanipulated container of information in the deepest file format you can process, that's your winner. As for which sensor that's best for your specific workflow, test. Go to your local rental house, borrow 2 or 3 cameras for an hour in a prep bay, record controlled footage, and evaluate it in your actual post-production pipeline in a full grading scenario. They will let you do this for free. Rental houses are there to help you, okay? If budget is a constraint, look backwards towards older cinema-centric cameras. The silicon was often excellent, and the software has finally caught up to use those things at their fullest potential, available to you now at pennies on the dollar. My F55 costs like 40 grand or something when it released. I got it for $2,000. Now, if budget isn't a constraint, the current generation is just extraordinary across the board. You just pick whatever you and your team need. You and your team will know better than a guy on YouTube to tell you what you'll need for a feature film or a television show or something. But either way, the answer has always kind of been the same. Know what you need, know what you're measuring, and measure it yourself. That's it for this video. Hope it wasn't too long. Lord knows it took me forever to write it. The sun has now officially gone down. You'll see me next time.